We move on to our next Silver Jubilee lecture. The topic for this lecture is Jharkhand in the Belly of the Indian Boom. This lecture will be delivered by Alpa Shah, Associate Professor, London School of Economics and Political Science, and chaired by William Pinch, Professor at Wesleyan University, Middletown, Connecticut. Can I please request the chair to take over the proceedings?
Well, it's my great privilege and pleasure to introduce Dr. Alpa Shah, who will be presenting her lecture. Dr. Shah is Associate Professor, as we've just heard, at LSE. She trained in geography at Cambridge and then did her PhD at the LSE, and after which she taught briefly at Goldsmiths, the University of London, well, not briefly, 8 years, and then returned to the LSE after that. She's the author of the book In the Shadows of the State, Indigenous Politics, Environmentalism, and Insurgency in Jharkhand. She's published numerous essays and articles and edited 7 volumes, which is amazing. And she's currently working on Maoist-inspired insurgency, as I understand it, in India, and will be presenting on Jharkhand in the belly of the Indian boom. So please welcome Alpa Shah.
Friends and colleagues, I'm honored to deliver a lecture at ADRI in memory of Arvind Narayan Das. I first arrived in Bihar in 1999, a year before Jharkhand was formed. I did not know then that I would devote the rest of the next 2 decades to learning from the people of Bihar, Jharkhand, as a social anthropologist. On that first visit in 1999, I spent a few months in Ranchi city, which was then still a quiet backwater. On that first visit, to my amazement, I found there, in the neighborhood of Kanke, a wonderfully organized research office with the most fascinating library and files on different research topics which mattered to Bihar, Jharkhand, with newspaper cuttings and dedicated research reports. It was run by an impressive woman dressed in a black cotton sari, wearing sindoor and bindi, who was a fountain of knowledge, inspiration, and good advice, and who spoke with a thick Dutch accent. That was Dr. Katinka Sinha Kerkhoff, and the office was that of the Ranchi office of ADRI. Katinka is not able to be with us for this conference, and that is sad, for she would have provided, she would have contributed a lot to the intellectual discussions that we have had over the last 5 days, and would also have presented some of her own work, which would have been great for us. Anyway, since that period, 18 years ago, I have lived in the hills and forests of Jharkhand amongst the Adivasi people as a social anthropologist for 2 long stretches of more than a year and a half each. In the years between, I have visited Bihar, Jharkhand virtually every year for shorter spells. In all of these periods, I have received generous help from ADRI, who have affiliated me as a visiting research fellow and have always provided sound advice. ADRI supported me when I was a doctoral student into postdoctoral research, and are now continuing to support my own research students. So I thank here Shaibalda and all the ADRI colleagues for not only putting this festival of scholars together for us, but also the support for which I have personally received. Though I never had the good fortune to meet Arvind Das, the questions he was raising in relation to agrarian unrest and socio-economic change have over the years become ever more important and inspirational in my own work. And I think they are significant more than ever now for the country as a whole. I'm therefore delighted to be able to celebrate ADRI and the legacy of Arvind Das in this small way through this lecture. Today I want to share with you some of the insights from the people of Bihar, Jharkhand, and the neighboring areas of Orissa, parts of West Bengal, Chhattisgarh, what was to have been Greater Jharkhand, as they appear in the field sites of a large research project I have been leading from the Department of Social Anthropology at the LSC. I reflect on this work also with the hindsight of my own long-term field work with Adivasi communities in Jharkhand in order to address the broad themes of this conference. So for the last 3 years, this is the village that I lived in Jharkhand for my first fellow research. For the last 3 years, with Jens Lerker from the Department of Development Studies at SOAS, I led a large research program based at the LSC Department of Anthropology, working with 5 postdoctoral fellows, Richard Axelby, Dalal Bendabali, Brendan Donegan, Jaya Silan Raj, and Vikramditya Thakur in 5 different sites across India. Together we sought to explore how and why, despite India's celebrated economic growth, Adivasis and Dalits remain at the bottom of the Indian economic and social hierarchy. Economists have shown us that social discrimination continues to mark the contours of poverty in India. The rate of poverty decline amongst Adivasis and Dalits has been much less than that experienced by all other communities. Moreover, while incidences of poverty vary across regions, Dalits and Adivasis are worse off almost everywhere across the country. What economists are less well able to do, as Pranab Burden, some 30 years ago, recognized in his conversations between economists and anthropologists, is to explore the processes, dynamics, and relations behind these patterns. To explore how and why India's Adivasis and Dalits are at the bottom of the Indian social and economic hierarchy, we need to complement economic data with a grassroots approach to the processes of inequality and how they are experienced. The fine-grained, detailed studies explaining rather than describing durable poverty that have been called for by John Harris, amongst others. Embracing this call, our research, we took as a starting point the proposition that poverty must be understood through social relations, relationally. We put the historically developed social relations between Adivasis, Dalits, and other groups at the center of the analysis, for these relations are often unequal power relations which reproduce poverty. We designed a program of research based on extensive long-term field research, living for at least a year with Adivasi and Dalit communities across the country, placing their perspectives and experiences at its center. We wanted to understand the changing situation of Adivasis and Dalits in the wider regional political economy in the context of oppression, exploitation, and discrimination, livelihood patterns and related land and labor and migration patterns, intra-caste, tribe and gender relations, and also in relation to their own social struggles. Many issues have emerged from this research, which is going to be the basis of our book, Entrenching Social Inequality, which will be published later this year. But the one that I want to focus on today is the significance of seasonal casual labor migration and the place of Bihar and Jharkhand within that in the context of a national picture. Let me take you first through a whistle-stop tour of our field sites. So, anyway, you see here a map. It's not very focused, but So anyway, there we are in Bihar. That's where I've done most of my work. That's where Jens Lerker has worked. One of our sites was a chemical industrial belt here in Cuda in Tamil Nadu. We also worked in Telangana, here in an Adivasi-dominated area. I'll tell you more about these sites in a minute. They're in Kerala, in the tea plantations of the Western Ghats, and they're in the Narmada Valley in Maharashtra, and then right up in the country in Himachal. So let's turn first to the rundown tea plantations of the Pyramid in Kerala, where from the 1860s onwards, Tamil Dalits were brought to work as indentured laborers in the tea plantations developed by the colonial planters. And this is the site of Jaya Silan Raj. Over the years, these Dalits won a modicum of rights as plantation labor, with some security of employment and welfare benefits such as free healthcare and the promise of pensions. But with economic liberalization, cutbacks in the terms and conditions of labor set in, which were only sharpened by the global collapse of the tea economy in the 1990s. While some plantations started to close down, others were taken over by Indian multinational companies who used the moment to put in place a much more precarious labor force. Dalit men overwhelmingly lost their permanent work in the tea factories, and it was predominantly older Dalit women who continued the permanent tea plucker jobs in the tea plantations, providing the family with some security of housing. So these are these tea plantations in Kerala, and here's a photo of the Dalit women tea pluckers. The Dalit youth, the young Dalits, now more educated than their parents, tried to find better jobs in the cities back in Tamil Nadu, but the best that they could get is semi-skilled work, dyeing textiles and stitching and making garments or machinery. Out of the confines of the enclaves of the tea plantations, many of these Dalits have chosen to hide their caste names in the face of overt caste discrimination in Tamil Nadu, which make it difficult for them to get a house or a job when people know that they are Dalits. As the Dalits back in the tea plantations have tried to rise against the cutbacks in the plantations, their bargaining power is increasingly being undercut by the plantation owners, bringing in migrant labor who is even poorer than the local Dalits. Fascinatingly, in the pyramid, they have begun relying on Adivasi migrant labor, Santalis, brought from Jharkhand, to do the tea plucking work that Dalits are compelled to move out of. For the tea plantation owners, the Adivasis are a cheaper, more docile workforce that can be hired on a casual piece rate basis without any of the rights that permanent Dalit workers had to housing and pensions and healthcare. Brought in just for 8 months of the year or so, displaced from their kinship support networks and not speaking the local language, they are not in a position to mobilize as the Dalit women have against the plantation management. Then there is the coastal belt of Cuda in Tamil Nadu, where Brendan Donegan worked. This region, which was an erstwhile landlord-dominated agricultural belt, has with economic liberalization been the target of the state industries promoted corporations for Tamil Nadu, SIPCOT, for the development of the highly toxic chemical and pharmaceutical industries which now are lining the Bay of Bengal. The one which bears an immediate impact on Donegan's site is a newly established gelatin factory, locally called the Bone Factory, whose entire production is for export. Run with a business partner in Japan with joint ventures in China and Taiwan, it makes gelatin for gelling agents in food, pharmaceuticals, photography and cosmetics from cow bones. So that's the industrial belt there. The shift from agriculture to industry has meant that the local Dalit and Irula Adivasi labor are no longer bonded in agricultural servitude to high caste landlords. However, while Dalit women still work in the village, Dalit men are now incorporated into the lowest rungs of the chemical industry. In Donegan's village, most are working in daily contract wage work, cleaning bones with toxic chemicals. The jobs are controlled by the erstwhile landlords whose relatives own the factories, get the permanent jobs, and who themselves now dominate the supply of labor and materials to the factories. Affirmative action has enabled some Dalits here to achieve a degree of upward mobility, occupy low-level state sector jobs, mainly in the police, and also to develop Dalit caste and class consciousness in the area. However, as the Dalits in the factories try to rise against their exploitation, their bargaining power is being increasingly cut, here too, by migrant Adivasi and Dalit labor being brought in from eastern India, Orissa, Bihar and Jharkhand, repeating a process that was in place in the tea plantations in Kerala. Super exploited, these migrants live in squalid conditions, often 40 to 70 people in one large room, and work for longer hours and pay than any of the local low-caste labor. From Tamil Nadu, we moved to the heart of the country on the banks of the Godavari in Bhadrachalam, Telangana, where Dalal Ben Babali was placed. Typical of the Adivasi-dominated areas of central and eastern India in the states of Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh and Orissa, this is a place where Adivasi land rights had been constitutionally protected, but which also has a huge wealth of India's natural resources, coal, iron ore, bauxite and timber. Despite a long history of social movements, Adivasi land and forest rights in these areas have been successively eroded, as they have in many other areas. Here, Adivasis, mainly Koyas, rich in land and forest resources in which they once practiced shifting cultivation, were first made increasingly poor by the Kamas and Reddy-led landlords. The landlords came to the area from the coastal belts of Andhra Pradesh in search of land for agriculture and tried to take over the land of the Adivasis and control their labor, and that of the Dalits, the Marigas, through relations of servitude. Subsequently, and under the control of these new dominant caste landlords, Adivasis were further dispossessed of their land for industrialization and economic growth. A paper factory of the ITC paperboards and specialty divisions, which prides itself on now being the largest manufacturer of packaging and graphics boards in South Asia, was set up here, and local Adivasis and Dalits became increasingly dependent on the low-paid casual labor in the informal economy. That's the paper factory there in the distance on the banks of the Godavari. Since India's economic liberalization, these areas have been the target of large multinational corporations seeking to harvest the natural resources which lie underneath. The ITC factory has not only taken over land for its plants, but is also increasingly destroying the surrounding forested areas, which is a crucial livelihood resource for the Adivasis, by replacing the diversity of local forests with eucalyptus plantations, which kill most local flora and fauna. The main local beneficiaries of this industrial development have been the high caste Kama and Reddy landlords, whose sons and daughters now aspire to move not only out of the area, but also out of India to live in the US. The son of one particularly large Kama landlord, a very well-heeled doctor, in fact now owns several different private hospitals in the United States and has his own private jet to get from one hospital to the next. Meanwhile, the mainly landless Lambadas and Marigas are doing casual contract work in the factories and in the cotton fields of the Kamas, their access to work controlled by the Kama landlords and at their beck and call. The Koyas have more land to fall back on, enabling them to keep some autonomy from the factory work which they don't like. However, it is questionable how long they will be able to maintain this autonomy, and some of them are already in the same situation as Lambadas and Marigas. Moreover, none of these Dalits and Adivasis are likely to get the permanent factory jobs that people from non-Dalit Adivasi communities monopolize. With their displacement by development and increasing rent prices, many have found it so expensive to live in the area that they have been reduced to living in plastic tents on occupied land, fetching water from a leak in a pipe as a way to fight for a home. From these Adivasi heartlands, let's go to the high mountains of Chamba in Himachal Pradesh, where Richard Axelby worked. Here, Muslim Gujarat STs and Hindu Gadi Adivasis have survived with their buffaloes, sheep and goats for centuries in the extreme climbs of the Sal Valley and beyond into the high Himalayas as nomadic agro-pastoralists. Population pressure, occupied with a limited number of grazing permits, means that both these groups have had to diversify out of the nomadic agro-pastoralism, but have done so in different ways. The Gujars migrating to Punjab to sell milk, the Gadis migrating more locally, while the higher castes continue to own the best agricultural land, get the best education, and get significantly more and better government jobs, as well as better private sector jobs. Here too, though, one finds that the hardest manual labor work constructing roads is being done by migrant labor being brought in from Bihar and Jharkhand. From the mountainous Himalayas of the old princely states, the final port of call is the Narmada River in the Maharashtra in Maharashtra, where Vikramditya Thakur lived with the Bhil Adivasi people. This is a site that attracted much international attention, where a large dam, the Sardar Sarovar Dam, was built in the name of development in the Satpura Hills. Displacing more than 30,000 people, its reservoir flooded the surrounding villages despite a huge international protest against the building of the dam. So, sorry, that's back in the Himalayas. So, Vikramditya Thakur compared the Bhils who are still in the hills with those who were resettled in the plains and with those who live in caste-dominated villages in those same plains. In the deforested hills, the Bhils still rely on tilling whatever land they can and from migrating as seasonal casual labor to the sugarcane plantations of Maharashtra and Gujarat. Displaced by the dam, their counterparts who have moved into the resettlement colonies and been given unalienable land have inserted themselves into the insecurities of the cash crop economy of farming BT cotton, papaya and bananas in the plains. We see here a slow class differentiation taking place amongst the Bhils, and it is interesting to note that those who were resettled in the plains were led by the better educated Bhils who were once the activists, the local activists of the movement against the Narmada Dam. They have learnt about cash crops from the nearby Gujar farmers who sold them the land for resettlement and whose sons and daughters are themselves moving out of agriculture. In the nearby Gujar villages, we find a different group of Bhils who have historically been the agricultural serfs of the Gujar landlords, but in more recent times have been able to so-called free themselves from these landlords, but only to migrate to work as manual labor in the brick factories. Though the resettlement Bhils have embarked on the kind of farming which was once the domain of the Gujars, and there are some signs of class differentiation among the Bhils, Thakur is not optimistic of any trajectory of significant upward mobility. Though the Bhil youth aspire for better English medium education and better state sector or private sector jobs, the resettled Bhils in fact face the same fate as their counterparts in the caste-dominated nearby villages and those in the hills. That is cycles of back-breaking work of migrant agricultural labor in the farms of Gujarat and in the brick kilns of nearby states. This is the migrant Bhils going away, and this is their huts by a sugarcane plantation. Now, what is fascinating about looking at the country as a whole through the lens of such long-term ethnographic studies in different sites is not just that Adivasis and Dalits across all our sites remain at the bottom or end of the social and economic hierarchy, but also that the processes which keep them there are dependent both on the continuities of inherited inequalities of power that they are subjected to and directly linked to the changing ways in which capitalism is expanding across the country. Though there are differences between Adivasis and Dalits, across the country, both groups now enter multiple livelihood strategies which mix farm work, if they have access to agricultural land, with hard manual labor in the most uncertain, precarious, exploitative work conditions in an India-wide informal economy that serves the interests of capital. It is now fairly well established that India is not experiencing the kind of agrarian transition to capitalism which took place in Europe. That is the classical model of homegrown capitalist development in agriculture, which then fed into capitalist industrial development, a process which turned peasants into workers, all mediated by the state. Indeed, Jens Lercher, following Henry Bernstein, has argued that the agrarian transition of capital has been bypassed in India. What we see today in India is a general pattern which Henry Bernstein has shown is part of globalization. Bypassing accumulation in agriculture and the classic transition of capitalist accumulation in agriculture for national industry, industrial development in the South today depends on relations between their state apparatus and capital on one hand, and international finance and global product markets, including commodity chains, on the other. This development is marked by the expansion of neoliberal finance capitalism, which has involved the taking over of land for mining, urban and industrial growth, and sheer financial speculation, which activists refer to as the land grab. The overall effect is not only that employment in agriculture has decreased, but that this has not led to a significant increase in employment in manufacturing in the industrial sector. Many have therefore argued that Indian growth has been jobless. The result of this neoliberal economic model is the absolute growth of informalized work. Informalized work now comprises all work in the informal sector, but also well above half the work in the formal sector. All the rest of the working population, 92%, have almost no security of employment or welfare benefits. They are trapped with low wages or vulnerable self-employment and miserable work conditions. One of the most significant consequences of this development trajectory is that rather than the formation of an urban proletariat, what we have in India is people who keep whatever land that they may have in rural areas, while at the same time migrating to work seasonally in more modern urban sectors. Marginal and small farmers increasingly turn to seasonal labor migration. These are the scores of circular migrant laborers who Jan Bremen has devoted his life to analyzing and has called wage hunters and gatherers, transcending and working across both the agricultural, industrial and the rural-urban divides. The numbers are very difficult to establish, for there is no survey that captures seasonal labor migrants in India. The official economic survey 2016-2017 now estimates internal labor migration in India to be about 140 million. Other estimates have varied, including those made by people in this room, have varied between 100 million to 80 million to 50 million. On the basis of how this migration works within households in Jharkhand, I would suggest that these are still very modest estimates, as they do not include all the people per household affected by seasonal casual labor migration, even if at any one moment in time all are not engaged in the migration. For the very point of this migration is that a household needs multiple means of livelihoods to survive, and the migrant must not be considered separate from other members of the household. So people often take turns to migrate within households, for example. If seen in this way, it is possible that we are not talking about just 140 million who are fundamentally affected by seasonal casual labor migration, but perhaps even 600 million people, I would argue. Crucially, what we find is that there is both a caste-tribe dynamic to this seasonal casual labor migration and also a regional dimension to this migration. To take caste first, Adivasis and Dalits are overwhelmingly represented. We have found Adivasis and Dalits doing the most physically demanding jobs with the worst remuneration in brick factories in Calcutta, in the chemical industries in Tamil Nadu, in the tea plantations of Kerala, in the construction sites of Delhi, and in agricultural work in Gujarat. What we know from our work and that of others is that the overall condition of this migration is characterized by extreme exploitation and oppression. Labor is recruited by labor contractors. There are often a series of contractors involved, from the village level recruiter, who can often come from the labouring communities, to the larger contractors who make the transition to faraway places, determine conditions of housing and work, give out payments. Advances which bond labourers in a form of neo-bondage characterize this migration, making each labourer forced to sell their labour power to pay off the debt they have incurred. These are advances most often taken as a large one-off cost for life cycle rituals such as marriage, death or birth, repaying debts because of healthcare costs. They are dependent on the contractor for housing in places of work and access to money for food. They work extremely long shifts, longer than that of local labour, live in extremely poor quality housing, which are usually labour camps cut off from the rest of society, and they have no rights to basic social security, no healthcare, no food subsidies, no schools. Secondly, the regional dimension, where region intersects with caste. Typically, the most exploited of the migrant labour comes from central and eastern India. Jharkhand, parts of Bihar, Chhattisgarh, Orissa, parts of MP, parts of Andhra, Telangana. These are regions which have historically been less well developed and where households are otherwise dependent on agriculture. Seasonal labor migration is a huge part of the everyday life of poor Adivasis and Dalits, as well as of other low castes and Muslims across India, but especially so in these states. Unless year-round work opportunities are at their doorstep, both Adivasis and Dalits will have at least one or more member of the household migrating away to work in brick factories, agricultural fields, garment work, or as construction labor, overwhelmingly jobs that are classified as low-skilled and remunerated accordingly. Migrant labor from Central and Eastern Indian regions is usually the most lowly paid in the region to which they are migrating, and the terms and conditions of their work are crucially worse than that of the local Dalit and Adivasi labor. They are more prone to oppression and exploitation as they usually do not speak the local language and are kept separate to the local Adivasis and Dalits. Furthermore, they are not seen as citizens of the state when migrating, so do not have access to amenities for the local poor in the places they migrate to, like subsidized ration or education facilities. So we find this in Tamil Nadu, where Brendan worked, where Adivasis and Dalits from Eastern India, they live in these dismal dorms. They're sharing often the same little space, several of them the same space to sleep as they work in shifts. They are more exploited than the local Tamil Dalits. While local Tamil Dalit contract labor works in the bone factory, usually doing just 1 hour of 1 8-hour shift 6 days a week. The Eastern Indian migrants regularly work between 1 and 4 shifts in a row, 7 days a week. They achieve the seemingly impossible feat by means of an informal understanding with other workers and supervisors in which workers take turns to sleep in a corner of the factory. Needless to say that they have no access to PDS rights, healthcare, education, or any other basic welfare measures. In Kerala, the Jharkhandi workers are maintained as casual workers, are not even considered for promotion to temporary worker status, which most of the Dalits have, and most of the Dalits actually have permanent status, or at least, at the very least, temporary status, as I said. This denial of temporary or permanent work status means that they do not have provident funds, annual leave, medical leave, and other benefits that are provided to the permanent and temporary workforce. They are paid less than half the minimum wage in all other sectors in Kerala. Their living conditions are also far worse than that of the local Dalit labor. They are forced to live in small houses, several families in one tenement, whereas the local Dalits have one family per tenement. They do not have access to PDS rice, the dal and kerosene, which other workers benefit from. And of course, on top of all this, they do not speak the local language. So what we see clearly emerging through this research is that economic growth has crucially used the low status social difference of migrant labor, their region and land-based alienness, and language-based alienness to undercut local low-caste workers and make the overall labor force completely insecure and super exploitable. Every year, people will find themselves in circumstances where they are migrating to a new place when they most often do not speak the local language, doing manual labor in living conditions and with wages that few locals would agree to. This labor circulation is central to cheapen and control labor and inside and outside the labor process in contemporary India to keep the social cost of production of this labor as low as possible. The anthropologist Claude Meyer-Sir, who Nitya Rao evoked yesterday, some time ago, in the context of Southern Africa, pointed out how such labor migration involves a distinctive mode of exploitation as it relies on dividing local workers, reproducing themselves entirely within the capitalist industries, and the rotation of a rural labor force which only partially reproduces itself in the same way. Crucially, this double labor market is dependent on various forms of discrimination. Following Meyer-Sir, we also see in India how Adivasi and Dalit migrant workers are paid much less than the local workers, as I've said. Meyer-Sir highlights that the processes which enable this double labor market to function are reinforced by a racist ideology that classifies the migrant workers as a priori unskilled and therefore relegated to low pay and unstable employment. Racism, here casteism, what we actually call in our book class casteism, also creates a hostile social environment around these workers, making it difficult for them to put forward their demands, demonstrate publicly, or ally with local workers. It is in this sense of circulating migrant labor, underwritten by caste and regional discrimination, that capitalism relies on a super-exploited migrant workforce of Adivasis and Dalits from eastern India. So just a few words by way of conclusion. The future, I am afraid looks bleak in India. The forms of financialization, land grabs for mining, special economic zones, and pure rent speculation, which increasingly create, to paraphrase Mike Davis, not only a country of slums, but also a country that will crucially be ever more dependent on the seasonal labor migration underwritten by the intersection of caste and region. Though some of these sectors, such as mining, are alleged to create jobs, they are in fact relatively few, and there is no guarantee that, as has been the case in all our other eras, that these jobs will not go to will go actually to the poor, impoverished locals. They'll actually go to the outsiders. It is hard to know where the challenges to these systems of inequality will come from. The dominant paradigm is at best only about social protection, which, though very important, is still peanuts in the big picture. Will the challenge come from the people affected themselves? It is well known that it is very difficult for migrant labor to mobilize to improve their circumstances in their workplaces. They're totally at the hands of the contractors and the bosses. Labor unions are usually kept out of these sites. For in the few instances of autonomous worker strikes we have had, for example, the tea pluckers in Kerala, it was the Dalit women who mobilized, but the Jharkhandi tea plantation labor was kept out. Moreover, typically, it is this migrant labor that is being brought in to break the local labor struggles. Yet it would be a mistake to think that this labor is under total domination. For the subaltern studies scholars did have a point by bringing our attention to dominance without hegemony. The very ability to migrate and have multiple sources of livelihoods back at home enables labor, especially Adivasi labor, to have a degree of autonomy over their own lives in relation to the forces of economic exploitation, as alluded to and articulated by Kaushik Ghosh this morning. This is the reason why we can't look at labor and social welfare struggles apart from land and forest struggles when we think about the belly of the Indian economy from the perspective of Jharkhand, Bihar. The struggle for protecting land and forest rights, especially under the new regimes of dispossession for mines and industries and special economic zones, is as significant as the more classical labor struggles and social welfare struggles in ensuring the prevalence of multiple livelihood strategies and hence the autonomy of Adivasis and Dalits in the belly of the Indian boom. Arvind Das always separated his studies of agrarian change in Bihar from the conditions of Chota Nagpur because of the protection that the Chota Nagpur had from the Chota Nagpur tenancy laws, which made the situation of Jharkhand different to that of Bihar. Those laws are now under attack and undergoing a major transformation. It seems more important than ever to think about the significance of this in a broader national picture. What I have tried to draw attention to is the significance of seasonal migrant labor from Jharkhand, Bihar to the belly of the Indian economic boom. The ways in which capitalism in India is using the intersection of caste, tribe, and region to further entrench the divisions and to suggest that the struggle for land and forest rights remains as important as the struggle for labor rights and social security measures in contemporary India. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that very grim picture. I have many notes that I've taken, but I don't have a specific question, so I think I will open the floor to questions, and I would just ask, as per the instructions on the sheet in front of me, that questioners keep their questions succinct and please restrain yourselves from the impulse to engage in long monologues. Yes, Subrata.
I share your observation about the green realities so elegantly articulated in this paper. I also find in this paper an excellent demonstration of a hiatus between society and its intellectuals. Paper after paper, I have heard only a denunciation of India's development, India's politics, and the harm that the Indian state does to its most vulnerable. Now, that is a problem if there is such a growing gap between society and its intellectuals. Where do we go from here? Is it also not the case that from 1999 we have come a long way in terms of what Geoffrey Wood has called compassionate rationalism, what I would like to call compassionate constitutionalism? Asian Development Research Institute should look at India in the Asian perspective and ask, what other model can develop different results? Should we as a body engage only in denunciation, but also not in comparison, introspection, reflection, and prognosis? Otherwise, in this sumptuous conference where we are funded by the very people we will denounce, our status will be transformed from social analysts and critics to court jesters.
Thank you so much for this comment. I totally agree with you that denunciation it should not turn into just denunciation. But I think that here today and over the last few days, we're actually doing something extremely important. It's not just an intellectual exercise that we're engaged in this current moment in time. Because what we are creating here in this arena, in this conference, is actually we're keeping alive the spaces for alternative debates. There are spaces for having those critical discussions which are being closed off in so many other parts of the country. So I see our role here in this forum not just as intellectuals, but as intellectuals who are fundamentally engaged in society and keeping space for the battles that are very important to social struggles today, because we need to keep them open at all levels, not just in spaces on the ground, but not just in the spaces of the ground, but on the ground, but also in spaces like this. So I think that it's a tribute that we are actually being funded by the government, by some of the people who we are also criticizing, and this is actually a very, very healthy thing that is happening in this conference. So yeah, while I completely agree with you, I see what we are doing here in a more sophisticated way, in a way which does not separate society from intellectuals, and as a space of activism in and of itself.
Okay, so we have a question here, and then a question here, and then a question. I don't see anybody in the back. I apologize if I'm missing people in the back. So here. Yes, you. Yeah, I'm sorry. Is it Jerry? Yeah.
Thank you. I interpret what you are describing, Alpa, as forms of labour market segmentation. That putting a bigger framework around it, it's a discussion of the way in which labour market segmentation plays out in the Indian economy. Now, all labour markets are segmented, and the forces driving segmented are very strong, because that's the way you raise the rate of profit, you can make workers compete with each other, you lower wages, you lower the wage share. So that's like a universal factor, a universal phenomenon, which takes different shapes in different places. In some places it's migrants form a segment, elsewhere it's language, or it's caste, or it's gender. So for me, the answer, and perhaps the answer also to the question of, which is sort of, how do you generate a positive spin on this, is you have to think about what can you do, not about the specifics that you have been talking about, but about the process of segmentation more generally. In other words, how can you establish a basic framework of rights and protections across all labour market segmentations, which is actually the way in which the adverse effect of labour market segmentation has been reduced in industrialised countries today. And you sort of dismiss social protection in the course of what you said. I think that's wrong. I think that you have to look at those elements and see how you can actually build up a structure which can apply to the workforce as a whole across all of the segments of the labour market.
So should I take a couple more questions? Yeah, so let's take a couple more questions and then we'll have some response. So over here.
Oh, yes. This is not a question, this is a comment, and I'll keep it extremely brief. I'd like to say that I found this an excellent and worthwhile presentation. It's instructive and it is so willing. And I think what it deserves is also a great deal more popular dissemination in, say, fora like national dailies. So it would be a pity if this were to be restricted just to... I think there is some sense in which we, the citizens of this country, deserve to have a properly denunciatory view of our own selves. So I think this is an excellent piece of work.
Okay, Jan Bremen, and then in the back. But first, Professor Brennan. Need a microphone. It's coming. It's right behind you.
Thanks for what is coming. I won't comment on the presentation because I thoroughly, like most of us, agree with what you have said. What I would like to point out is the disjuncture and the contrast between the indeed grim reality which you have said at the bottom of the economy and at the bottom of society, either so-called at home, which is not any longer at home for many, and for those who are wandering around in the country at large. Between that grim reality and what we are told, what the real situation is, Aceh didn't have come. And Aceh didn't have come for the most vulnerable. It's put on billboards that chorus of Dalit women have now experienced Aceh didn't. That contrast between what I call fake news and what is the grim reality has to be brought out as long and as best as we will be allowed to do so. More power to you, Alpa.
So you want to respond to those? We would take one more. So one more, right in the back, yes. In the middle.
Thank you for this interesting presentation. In Jahanabad area of Bihar, where Maoists were active during 80s, I met somebody who was part of one, let's say, caste militia. But when the assertion grew from the Dalit side, it became difficult for those dominant castes to continue with those social practices. After that, there is a situation wherein Musahars, who are one of the extremely backward caste, if they have to be taken to a metropolis as laborers, the contractor is from, happens to be from one of the dominant castes, and his role is to take these laborers who do not know very often which place they are going to, what will be the nature of the work, and they are huddled together in third-class compartments, and they are carried to different places, many thousand kilometers away. So I'm curious if you could comment on the nature of the contractors, if they are involved in the labor migration in the areas that you have worked in. Thank you.
If you would comment on the nature of the contractors in these labor negotiations. I think that was the question, particularly he was referring to Jahanabad. So, would you like to answer that? And then I think we might have time for one more question after that. Go ahead.
So I'll just take your question first. The nature of the labor contractors is different in different areas, but what we find in many of the sites is that the first stage of the labor contractor, the person that actually takes people to different sites, often comes from the same villages and the same communities, which is quite different, as I had been led to think to an earlier era, although Crispin Bates a few days ago, was it day before yesterday, presented to us a very different history of an earlier era, one that I did not recognize. So I don't know specifically about Jahanabad, but we can talk about that more in a later session. So to come back to Jerry, I appreciate what you're trying to say, but my intention was not to dismiss social protection. My intention was to say that this is one of many other struggles that need to happen, and actually, where is the much broader struggle to challenge the form of capitalism that is taking place in India? Where is that challenge? We need to, there has to be that social protection won't be able to address that much bigger, much larger structural question. So social protection is very important, but the thing that I was trying to draw attention to here is how important the struggle for land and forest rights are alongside those of social protection measures, especially when we think about Adivasis, because the autonomy that they're able to have right now, from not being totally dominated, from having from being able to enter alternative spaces of struggle, is based on their ability to access land. So I wanted to bring together the various forms of struggles that are important in contemporary India: social protection struggles, labor rights struggles, land and forest rights struggles, but also to draw attention to the fact that none of these struggles are actually going to enable us to challenge the much wider problems of growing inequality in India, which are structural problems which need a structural approach. Okay, so Jan, thank you so much. I don't have much to say apart from to agree with what you're saying, what you have said. And thank you for your suggestion of translating some of this into popular languages. In fact, once the book is out in December, that's what we have decided to do, is that to have it published in Hindu and Telugu, but also to have more shorter versions of some of the conclusions in the more popular languages on the web, on blog sites. So yeah, and if anybody has suggestions of where those should go, or if you do, I'd be very grateful to know. Thank you.
So technically we're done at 12:40, but this started a little late, so I don't know how much time we have. One more question. So, well, then we'll take the person in the blue right here. No, I was actually, since we haven't had any questions from women, I thought it might be useful to have a question.
Ma'am, this was a brilliant paper. I was given the dense level of labor exploitation. I was just wondering what was the role of local level left parties, whether the communist parties at the local level, whether they were intervening in this entire picture or not.
Thanks. I'll answer that in relation to Jharkhand, since that is, after all, the focus of this paper. I worked in a Naxalite-dominated area for a long time, although I did not speak about them today. And one of the big failures, I think, of that movement has been to take seasonal labor migration seriously. They have not been able to basically address this migration in the forms of social struggles that they have engaged in. So I'm not saying that there isn't any hope from left parties, but that was the ground reality in the places that I worked in.
So perhaps just one more, since that was a quick one. Yes, right in the back there. Sorry.
Fabulous paper. I learned so much. Well done. The Amitav Ghosh wrote this wonderful book, Sea of Poppies, which gave us a great insight about indentured labour being extracted from Bihar to other places in the world. I mean, how far do you see your material, because of the social relationships around which this labour is in these depressed migrant conditions, as a kind of an internalisation of indentured labour?
I think the situation is quite different to that we once had. Even in the tea plantations in Kerala, where labour was once indentured, we don't have. Today, this labour is not indentured. They are migrating out of the tea plantations. They're working in the factories and garment industries in Tamil Nadu. And though there are forms of bondage, which Jan Brayman and Isabel Garan and Amit Prakash have called near bondage, that are significant in the ways in which this migration is taking place. I think it's a different system to that of the indenture. There's a whole other dimension to your question, which is the social effect of being indentured and the kind of humiliation that gets internalized over generations. And I think that is a very, very vast and large question, and we probably don't have the space and time to go into that now, but it would be a very good question to take up for discussion.
So I guess I must apologize. Do we have any more time for another question, or is that, no, we're out of time. So I'm sorry for those who weren't able to ask questions, but perhaps you can pursue it further after the talk. So thank you very much again.